The draft that almost ruined SmackDown 2010. Let's watch.
WWE's draft has made for good opportunities to create talent and help them develop better. This in turn allows for more variety as well as huge main event stories across two brands. What makes this so good is that the usual opponents have more to deal with as opposed to the previous style. So if Triple H faced just Stone Cold and The Rock, with the brand split he could face other talent that has a chance to rise to the occasion. For several years the brand split has created new stars and gave many guys the chance to shine. The other system wouldn't have allowed for the likes of Eddie Guerrero to become champion because it didn't need to. It was always going to have the likes of Austin and Rock as champion with no real chance for somebody like Eddie because he was never even positioned for that role in the first place. SmackDown's thing at the time was for talent to show more of what they were capable, whereas Raw was more for the finished product to shine bright. This is exactly how it was until 2019 when Fox started airing SmackDown and making it the A show. Whenever a talent did well for themselves and became a star, they'd go to Raw. Consider it like the big leagues in some ways. That's how they viewed it, not the fans themselves. That's up for debate. While SmackDown was taped, Raw was live. 2004 was a bit even on paper, but Triple H was never going to SmackDown. 05 was very even, I'd say, in some ways. Kurt Angle was the biggest loss that they didn't receive. However, they made good in the other areas. There was some great trades going down. John Cena to Raw, Batista to SmackDown. That's the most fair trade I've ever seen. It makes sense for both of them to leave their brand and begin new stories, because they beat the final boss. It was great. SmackDown's status was slowly becoming more apparent. It was the B show in their eyes. It's a bit unfortunate, but at the same time, because they weren't focused on it as much as Raw, there was many things better with it. The matches, for one, were way better on SmackDown. It was the wrestling show, a reputation it garnered in the days of Paul Heyman a few years earlier. Raw was always viewed with more respect and honor for some reason. This would show a lot more with the pay-per-views being main evented by Raw more often in almost the entire year. Even when they took away the brand split pay-per-views, Raw was still main eventing all of them. 2007's draft was not that kind to SmackDown. King Booker, Chris Benoit, and Mr. Kennedy went away from the show, and Raw was starting to pick apart the other shows. ECW was dried up. It was horrible for that show. They didn't care one bit, and made SmackDown seem like prime Attitude Era in comparison to it. The next two drafts were more reasonable for SmackDown. They gained a lot. Jeff Hardy and Triple H for Batista and Rey Mysterio is a fair trade, especially because Triple H had the WWE Championship by his side. He was such a fresh change to see on SmackDown. JR commentating the shows as well was a bit weird but fresh once again. I think SmackDown's status at the time was more stronger and refined compared to previous years because the core of Jeff Hardy, Triple H, The Undertaker, Edge, and The Big Show is very strong and often led to some good stories and even better matches. SmackDown was tougher than previously. I really liked the balance of talent here. It was more balanced than previously. I'd say there was a bit of a loss in the mid-card, but is that really a problem when you have the likes of MVP, Shelton Benjamin, the Colones, and Brian Kendrick? It is a bit of a downgrade, I will say, though. 2009 was actually an improvement because while they lost The Big Show and Triple H, they got Chris Jericho, Rey Mysterio, Kane, and CM Punk. This was the first time that SmackDown actually benefited more than Raw. It had never happened before where they prioritized SmackDown over Raw on Friday nights got to reap the benefits. This was amazing because SmackDown had a greater core than previously. The mid-card was strengthened and had talent that could climb up and down the card with ease. Then newcomers like Dolph Ziggler, great young talent like John Morrison. The writers knew what they had and it made stories easier to book because it always led to good matches. SmackDown in 2009 was must-see TV and there's no exaggeration there. It was classic stuff. Even with Edge away due to injury, that summer was incredible and showed that SmackDown was miles better.
Maybe because I grew up on SmackDown. Like that was my first introduction to wrestling. I feel like SmackDown has always been good. Story-wise. Wrestling obviously, but like story-wise, I feel like they always had it. They've always been on point.
Better than Raw, which was very dry and repetitive.
Maybe it's a bias.
A revolving main event scene that constantly changed gradually without making things convoluted or ridiculous, like Raw, who were stuck with John Cena and Randy Orton. Cena and Orton was the rivalry from July to October. In that time, Jeff Hardy and CM Punk transitioned into Undertaker and Batista. So when 2010 rolled around and Edge and Chris Jericho entered the main event scene, it felt like the show could do no wrong when it came to the top of the card. Unfortunately though, Batista left for Raw, which at the time didn't feel like a huge hit, but that would come into effect after WrestleMania. The 2010 draft had a lot of effects on SmackDown. More than you realize because the show took a 180 right after Extreme Rules. It was always going to be hard to maintain that consistency that the show had in the summer of 2009. That time period is remembered fondly. So WrestleMania 26 comes around and passes. It was a decent show. Time for the draft. The draft was expected to be more impactful than previous years. The roster was even, and it could have been another interesting shakeup, especially because Raw had two strong babyfaces in John Cena and Randy Orton. Triple H was another name at the time, and looking at these men and their roles, it was likely that one of them would move, right? It just makes sense. Well, they didn't. Triple H was off TV for a couple of months, and at the time he was expected to return sometime around the summer. SmackDown though was once again rinsed, and it was very unfortunate how they did it because They really went for the jugular with this one. They took Edge, who had just returned. It kind of makes sense for Edge to return to Raw after 3 years, you know. Even though his name is synonymous with SmackDown, he had a lot more to do on Raw. Plus, his face run wasn't the best. Even though this was a logical change, Edge's run would turn out to be a huge mistake that we'll get into later. With that said, who else did Raw take from SmackDown? They went hard, and on paper, it might not seem huge, but they took R-Truth and John Morrison. These two made up a bunch of TV time throughout the year in the mid-card. Again, it really makes sense for them to change brands to give Raw a fresh change. The biggest hit, though, in my opinion, was Chris Jericho. Chris Jericho managed to reach his apex in 2009. He was one of the best performers, and it wouldn't be crazy to say all around that year he was the very best. It's not crazy at all. And this was mostly because of who he was on SmackDown. They weren't going to give him that freedom on Raw, not to mention that there was a certain pecking order there that was almost impossible to break through. Even Edge struggled to break through when he went to Raw at the time. Jericho was the heart of this era of SmackDown. He was the workhorse and the most reliable wrestler around. He peaked on SmackDown, but we didn't know it at the time. That run was incredible. Now we mentioned all that. Who did SmackDown get in return? On paper, most of it sounds good, but even then, you understand that it wasn't that fair of a trade. They got the Big Show, Christian, Kofi Kingston, and Kelly Kelly. This is a bit rough. It shouldn't be, but they got a couple of mid-carders and Kelly Kelly. That's basically what it was. When I mentioned mid-carders, obviously Kofi and Christian probably should have gotten pushed at the time, but that's how they viewed him. Big Show, though, was more of an upper mid-carder, semi-main eventer, but if this draft was actually fair, they would have got Randy Orton. You know, if you're going to go with Edge and Chris Jericho to Raw, they should have got someone huge in return. So at the time, people knew SmackDown was a bit wrong. It's clear as day and would become more obvious over the next year. The main event scene on Raw was stacked, where SmackDown had to deal with Jack Swagger as the world champion. Another problem was the fact that because the rosters were so imbalanced, it meant that the mid-card scene would struggle too. They did get the likes of Cody Rhodes and MVP in the post-draft thing, but they wouldn't be used for a while. And even the tag team champions stopped coming around as often as they once did in the past. The only good story at the time was CM Punk and Rey Mysterio's. Jack Swagger wasn't the best champion. Big Show would have made for a better world champion, which isn't really saying much, but he really would have in comparison to Jack Swagger. But it wasn't much of a problem because Undertaker was coming back. Well, actually, he can't fully return because he broke his nose. Rey Mysterio broke his orbital bone during a match, unfortunately. This was the worst thing that could happen to SmackDown after the draft. They were in much need of star power. Rey, Big Show, CM Punk, these guys weren't enough to carry the top of the show. They needed a leader, a number one guy type. Undertaker's injury basically changed everything because he was supposed to win the title at Fatal 4-Way. They understood Swagger's run was disappointing and were ready to move on. And it's not known what would have been of the Undertaker's title reign, but one thing for sure is that it would have been better than what we got. Most definitely. Kane was pushed to the very top. Kane did deserve it though because of his contributions throughout the years and the fact that he never had a title reign for more than a day, but the stories weren't good. But okay, what about the mid-card? This was all over the place. Vance Archer had a random push that went nowhere. Christian and Matt Hardy were just around, and in Christian's case, it was a big miss. Best of all was my favorite feud of all time, Dolph Ziggler and Kofi Kingston. This thing, oh my god. They took R-Truth and John Morrison away just to have a million matches between those two for the IC title, and I barely remember Kofi winning a single match. They were having these matches every week like you were limited on GM mode or something. It was ridiculous. Drew McIntyre's Teddy Long story that summer was bad. I obviously have fond memories of the shows at the time, but SmackDown's very dry. It just was. You know, there's no dancing around it. SmackDown was dry. It had some sort of problem. One of the highlights of the year, it wasn't even like amazing or anything like that. One of the highlights of the summer on SmackDown for me was Lay Cool. They were annoying, but they were entertaining, I will say that. WWE understood that there was a problem with SmackDown. It was very light. Undertaker did return later on, but even then, it wasn't enough to fill in the gaps because of how dry everything else was, so they decided to do something very interesting. They traded CM Punk for Edge. This gave Raw a semi-main eventer, upper mid-card type guy to push to the very top, whereas SmackDown got a pure main eventer, one of the most decorated champions of that era, and this was a huge change that was much needed. The reason why this was much needed is because SmackDown was dry. Simple as that. Edge's return was basically them saying we made a mistake. You know, we should have gave SmackDown somebody much bigger in the draft. It was basically them admitting their mistakes.
I wonder how
but
they come
Edge's
up with
return
that.
really changed things, you know. Like, the Kane feud wasn't that, like,
not
good,
trade.
I'll be honest.
That
It wasn't
draft.
that good. But that star power kind of changed things. He always comes in clutch for SmackDown, and it was no different here. He was just a face this time around, and it worked very well for him. But SmackDown really suffered throughout the year, you know. Obviously, star power came in later on. But SmackDown, I'd say, got better once Edge returned. You know, once Edge returned in October. Yeah, there were stories that were, like, awful, stuff like that. Swagger soaring eagle. But it was much better than it was. And it did set the foundation for the next draft for the likes of Randy Orton, Mark Henry to come in. So there's that. Alright, what you guys think of SmackDown in 2010? Please comment down below. And that's it for this video. Make sure you hit the choke slam and the like button, or perhaps...
I don't know, maybe the ideas that they had just fell flat or something. I don't know. That does sound like a really awkward draft. They just gave all the good ones to Raw, and SmackDown just kind of was like, I don't know, they treated like a redheaded stepchild. So yeah, that trade was definitely needed. But that's gonna do it for this reaction, y'all. Make sure you leave some likes and comments down below. Let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you in the next one. Toodles.